Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are embarking on, well, a pretty massive historical and biological investigation. Our source material is really expansive, pulling from deep history, ancient culinary traditions, the rise and fall of the first civilizations, and some really cutting-edge molecular science.
It sounds like a lot, I know, but our mission is actually quite laser focused. We're trying to connect these fields that seem, totally separate, like the logistics of the first centralized states maybe 6,000 years ago, with the really dramatic decline we're seeing in modern human health today.
Right, we're looking for that common thread, that link in human history that could explain both how societies got structured and how our individual biological integrity holds up or doesn't.
Exactly. What ties state structure to, say, cellular health?
It's a phenomenal hook. Okay, so before we get down to the, microscopic details of cells, let's start big picture, huge historical context. We need to talk about the timeline of human dominance, what people often call the Anthropocene, right? The era where humans became this defining geological force.
Yeah, and if we think about the Anthropocene as these big jumps in environmental impact, you can sort of trace three major shifts. The first one, and arguably, the most profound, is fire.
Fire.
Fire was the original great hominid landscaping tool. We're talking at least 400,000 years ago. This ability to cook food, clear land, manage environments, it just drastically changed our evolutionary path.
Okay, so fire is number one, way back. Then much later, maybe around 12,000 years ago, we get the second big shift.
That's agriculture, permanent settlements, farming. This demanded a whole new kind of human organization, tying people to specific plots of land, managing resources differently, a huge change.
But here's the kicker, the really surprising part that this whole deep dive kind of hinges on: the state. The first large-scale, centralized, coercive entities like the ones in Mesopotamia, they show up much, much later.
Yeah, way later. We're talking only about 6,000 years ago, so thousands of years after agriculture started.
Thousands of years for these state structures to figure out how to actually mobilize and, frankly, monopolize those landscape modification technologies like farming for their own benefit.
And that delay, that gap, leads us straight into the big paradox we're wrestling with today.
Which is?
Well, we live in this age of just unbelievable technological power, right? Computers, medicine, knowledge. We have longer lifespans on average, that's true.
Yeah.
But you look under the hood at the actual quality of health. The explosion of chronic diseases, obesity, diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's. In a really fundamental biological way, we seem to be less healthy than our ancestors were, even just a few generations back.
It feels like our modern lifestyle, especially our diet, is somehow actively sabotaging the very genetic potential that took hundreds of thousands of years to evolve.
That's exactly it. And we need to understand why. What went wrong in that translation from ancient survival to modern living?
Okay, let's ground this investigation, literally. We start in the Mesopotamian alluvium, the so-called cradle of civilization. Why did the earliest states seem to coalesce around certain resources and not others? You're saying it boils down to logistics?
Pretty much, yeah, logistics and control. An early state trying to centralize power needed a specific kind of commodity. It had to be concentrated geographically. It needed to be synchronous, meaning it ripened or became available all at once.
Okay, synchronous, like harvest time.
Exactly. It also had to be non-perishable, so you could store it. And crucially, it had to be easily accessible. Think like a tax collector back then. You need something simple, something you can count or measure easily.
This brings us to that concept you mentioned, legibility. The state needs to make its population and the resources they produce legible, readable, countable, controllable.
Right. If your resources are hard to count, like, say, wild game or diverse roots and tubers harvested at different times, or if they require specialized knowledge the state doesn't have, it's very hard for the state to appropriate them systematically.
So what was legible?
Monocrop grain fields, especially cereal grains. Think wheat, barley. They ripen together, you can estimate yield per hectare, you can store the harvest in massive granaries, which themselves become symbols of state power, and you can easily count the population needed to farm it.
It makes the whole system transparent to the central authority. Manageable, taxable, simple.
If you were out there foraging diverse wild foods or maybe moving with herds, you were essentially illegible to the state. Much harder to control.
And what's really fascinating, you mentioned our sources challenge that old textbook story about Sumer, right? The whole miracle of irrigation in the desert organized by the state narrative.
Yeah, that's largely, well, not the full picture, possibly even wrong for the earliest stages. It turns out the first really large fixed settlements in the Mesopotamian delta actually popped up in wetlands,
Right.
rich, marshy areas.
Wetlands. not arid plains needing irrigation.
Not initially. Their foundation, their subsistence, it came overwhelmingly from the incredible biodiversity of those wetlands, fish, birds, reeds, tubers, wild game. It was an ecosystem of crazy abundance, actually much more resilient and less labor-intensive than grinding grain farming.
But those wetland resources, super productive year-round even,
Yeah.
but highly illegible, right? How do you tax a basket of fish accurately? Or count nesting birds?
Exactly. It's messy from a state control perspective.
Yeah.
And get this, if any major human landscaping was needed in those very early wetland settlements, it was probably drainage, not irrigation. Draining areas to create space for the settlement itself, and only later perhaps for those more controllable green fields.
So the state, in a way, traded ecological efficiency and resilience for political and economic legibility, control over efficiency.
That seems to be the pattern. And regardless of whether it was irrigation or drainage driving things later, the sources are really clear on what these early states valued most. It wasn't really the land itself, it was manpower and movable wealth. We can almost call it booty capitalism.
Booty capitalism, explain that.
Look at their own records. Read the victory accounts, the triumphal inscriptions from successful military campaigns back then. They almost never brag about conquering territory, about adding square kilometers to their domain.
Not like, 20th century calls for Lebensraum, living space.
Not at all. Their focus was intensely, almost obsessively on booty. What did they list? Livestock, precious metals, and absolutely critical, human prisoners. Manpower.
Because those things directly increase the wealth and the productive capacity of the capital city, right?
Yeah.
Instantly usable assets.
Precisely. And they were just grabbing random people. The records often get really specific. They'd list captured weavers, potters, metalworkers, distinguishing prisoners by their skills.
Wow, so it was like an inventory of acquired talent, a human resources raid.
You could see it that way. A talent pool forcibly relocated to enhance the economic engine and the luster of the court. It's all about appropriation, concentration of resources, not just drawing lines on a map.
Okay, so this grain population complex, as you called it, formed the core, the nucleus of state power, highly centralized. But that power couldn't just expand infinitely, could it? There must have been limits.
Absolutely. A huge physical boundary defined by a really fundamental constraint: transportation.
Ah, the physics of empire building, moving stuff around.
Especially bulky stuff like grain. If you're trying to collect taxes in the form of grain and haul it overland, the costs, the friction, it just skyrockets with distance. Moving grain 40 kilometers takes way more effort and resources than moving it 20 kilometers.
Makes sense. The animals hauling it, the people guarding it, they all need to eat too.
Exactly. The math is brutal. Even under the best conditions, let's say draft animals on a nice flat alluvial plain, the effective logistical reach for grain requisitions seems to have been limited to roughly maybe a 48-kilometer radius around the capital.
48 kilometers, that's it.
Beyond that, the grain you managed to collect was likely entirely consumed just by the effort the animals and labor required to bring it back. Diminishing returns hit hard.
So that radius, that 48K circle, pretty much defined the practical zone of control for an early city-state, the actual territory they could reliably tax and draw resources from.
Largely, yes. Cities tended to cluster right at the center of that potential circle, which is why the huge exception, the game changer, was water transport.
Rivers and canals.
Right. Water just slashes friction. If you could float that grain down a canal or a river on a barge, suddenly your catchment area, your zone of effective control, expanded dramatically.
So proximity to navigable water became the prime real estate. That's where the real power concentrated.
That's where you see the symbols of power clustering. The biggest grain stores, the major temples and shrines, the administrative elite. The state's power was literally mapped onto the waterways.
Okay, so you've got these core state zones, grain legibility, water logistics, and then surrounding them, the periphery, the non-state peoples, the ones often labeled barbarians in the state records. We tend to think of that as just conflict, right? States versus barbarians.
It's easy to see it that way, and there was conflict, raiding for sure, but the sources actually show something much more complex, more symbiotic. Often antagonistic, yes, but fundamentally necessary for the state to even exist.
How so? Necessary.
Well, think about it. By hyper-focusing on grain monoculture, the states created a really narrow agroecology. They got good at producing grain and maybe textiles, but not much else. They became heavily dependent on trade for almost everything else they needed.
Things they couldn't produce on the flat alluvial plain.
Exactly. Stone for building, copper and tin ores for bronze, timber, specialty oils, resins, and, crucially, a constant supply of slaves and captives for labor, often acquired from these non-state groups living in the mountains or peripheral zones.
So the barbarians were actually essential trading partners.
They were natural trading partners. As the state core got wealthier and more populated, its commercial exchange with these nearby non-state peoples actually increased. The periphery supplied raw materials and often manpower slaves, mercenaries maybe. In return, they got the state's surplus grain, textiles, maybe some metal goods.
It's a whole system then. A core dependent on its periphery, all built on the back of this centralized, legible resource base and defined by those hard logistical limits.
And it was inherently fragile. If those logistics got pushed too far, or the trade broke down, or the climate shifted, impacting the grain harvest, the whole thing could unravel pretty quickly. All right, let's pivot now. We take that same deep historical lens that focuses on how logistical constraints shape success, and we turn it inward, directly onto the human body. If the logistics of grain defined early states, maybe the logistics of cellular nutrition define our health.
That's the parallel we're drawing. We're moving from the Sumerian floodplain to, say, the modern human jawline. The shift feels jarring, but the underlying principle resource management is surprisingly similar.
And you mentioned we can use dental health as a kind of window, a proxy for overall health throughout history, thanks to Weston Price. Yes, the work of Dr. Weston Price back in the 1930s was revolutionary. He traveled the globe, systematically documenting isolated populations still eating their traditional diets and comparing them to genetically similar groups who had adopted modern processed Western foods.
And I wasn't just counting cavities, right?
No, far beyond that. He meticulously documented physical structure. He noted that what he called physical degeneration, things like crooked teeth, underdeveloped jaws, narrowed faces, pinched nostrils, these weren't just cosmetic issues. They were signs of systemic problems with bone growth, breathing, chewing, fundamental functional issues.
And does the older skeletal record back this up?
Dramatically. There was a major study looking at over 1,200 ancient Peruvian skulls spanning a long period. They found not a single skull with significant dental arch deformities like we see commonly today. Not one. Not one with major issues. Their teeth were generally straight, jaws broad and strong, facial structures robust. When Price compared this kind of ancestral physique to the people he saw in modernizing cities, he famously described it as, well, a sad wreckage in physique and often character. Strong words.
Wow. And you mentioned if we look at skulls over time, say from the Paleolithic up until maybe a century ago, there's a consistent pattern.
Astonishingly consistent. You see well-aligned teeth, powerful square jaws, faces that exhibit what artists call dynamic symmetry, often conforming to the mathematical golden ratio, or phi. This symmetry is something humans and animals, too, instinctively recognize as a sign of health.
But that pattern breaks down recently.
Abruptly. Skulls from the last 100 years or so start showing those deformities. Price documented. Crowding, underdevelopment, asymmetry. The blueprint seems to be failing.
Okay, so why? Our basic DNA code hasn't changed significantly in that short time. So how can our physical structure change so fast?
This is where epigenetics comes in. It's the crucial layer of control on top of our DNA. It's the system that mediates between your stable genes and your ever-changing environment.
So epigenetics isn't changing the genes themselves, but how they're used.
Exactly. Think of DNA as the hardware, the instruction manual. Epigenetics is like the software, or maybe chemical sticky notes and bookmarks, telling the cell which instructions to read, how loudly, and when. It modulates gene expression, turns genes on or off, or dials them up or down.
Can you give an example related to, say, bone growth?
Sure. Let's say you have a gene responsible for building strong bones. If your cells sense, through your diet, that there's plenty of vitamin D, calcium, magnesium, vitamin K2, all the necessary cofactors, epigenetic marks will tell that gene. Okay, open up, express yourself fully, build strong bone.
And if those nutrients are missing?
If those key nutrients aren't available, different epigenetic marks might say, hold on, resources are scarce, conserve, don't express this gene fully. So even with a perfect DNA sequence for bone building, the actual outcome, the bone density and shape, can be compromised because the epigenetic signals reflect environmental lack.
It's an adaptive system designed to respond to the environment, but you're saying it's maybe more fragile than the DNA code itself?
Much more fragile in some ways. DNA replication is incredibly accurate, almost perfect generation after generation. But epigenetic patterns, these chemical bookmarks, they're much more influenced by immediate environmental factors, especially nutrition and toxin exposure. Their fidelity, their accuracy from one generation to the next is less robust.
And errors can accumulate.
Errors can and do accumulate, and this has profound generational consequences. Think about the male germline, sperm. If a father lacks the essential nutrients needed to maintain the integrity of the epigenetic patterns in his sperm, the quality control slips.
And that affects the offspring.
We see evidence linking this. Errors accumulate, particularly as men age. And statistically, older fathers have higher rates of children with certain neurological conditions like autism or bipolar disorder. It suggests these epigenetic typos are being passed on. We're really just temporary custodians of this incredibly valuable genetic and epigenetic heritage.
That fragility, you said, can even show up within a single family, this idea of the sibling symmetry shift.
Right, we talked about dynamic symmetry signaling health. The sibling symmetry shift is an observation that quite often later-born children in a family, especially if the births are closely spaced, might show slightly less robust facial development compared to the firstborn.
Why would that happen?
It's hypothesized to be due to maternal nutrient depletion. The mother's nutritional stores might not have fully recovered between pregnancies. So the second or third child literally has slightly less raw material available during critical developmental windows to build bone and nerve tissue as robustly as the first.
So you might see, slightly flatter cheekbones, a narrower jaw, maybe teeth coming in a bit more crowded.
Exactly. Subtle differences, but potentially indicating that the developmental budget was tighter for the later siblings. It's not a genetic defect, it's potentially a reflection of fluctuating nutrient logistics across pregnancies.
Okay, so if maintaining this epigenetic integrity and supporting robust growth is so crucial, what did traditional diets consistently provide? You mentioned 4 pillars.
Yes, across diverse cultures, when you look at the diets that supported the kind of health Weston Price observed, 4 categories of foods consistently show up. These are like the cornerstones, the pillars of ancestral nutrition.
Let's go through them. What's pillar number 1?
Bone stock, or bone broth. This isn't just flavorful soup, it's a therapeutic powerhouse. It delivers glycosaminoglycans, things like glucosamine, chondroitin, hyaluronic acid, which are the literal building blocks for connective tissue. Joints, ligaments, tendons, cartilage, plus minerals. It builds the scaffold.
Okay, makes sense. Structure from structure. Pillar 2.
Organ meat, offal, liver, kidney, heart, brain, tongue. These were prized foods historically. We focus so much on muscle meat today, but organ meats are far, far more nutrient-dense, packed with fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, K, B vitamins, minerals like iron, zinc, copper.
Things that are often lacking in modern diets.
Critically lacking. It's funny, you look back at cookbooks from, say, the 1950s, and you'll still find recipes like calf brain fritters listed as just normal food. Shows how quickly we lost that tradition.
Okay, pillar 3.
Fresh, unadulterated foods. And the key here is source matters. It's not just about eating fruits and vegetables, it's about the quality. Our sources emphasize a really alarming trend. The actual nutrient content of our modern food has plummeted.
How so?
Industrial farming practices, soil depletion, they've systematically stripped nutrients out of the soil and therefore out of the plants and the animals that eat those plants. Our food staples are becoming like nutritionally dilute versions of what they once were.
Do we have data on that?
Oh yeah, it's pretty stark. One example, the average iron content in meat dropped by something like 47% between 1930 and 2002. You see similar steep declines for minerals like selenium and zinc, vitamins like C across fruits, vegetables, and meats. We're eating more food, but getting less actual nutrition.
Forcing the body to work harder to get the raw materials it needs for everything, including maintaining that epigenetic code.
Precisely. Pillar number 4.
Fermented and sprouted foods. Why are these so important?
Because plants have defense mechanisms. They can't run away. So they produce anti-nutrients, things like phytates, lectins, enzyme inhibitors, and natural toxins to deter pests and animals from eating them.
Things that can irritate our gut or block nutrient absorption.
Exactly. Sprouting and especially fermentation are traditional methods used worldwide to neutralize these compounds. Think lacto-fermented vegetables like sauerkraut or kimchi, traditional sourdough bread making, even things like traditional beer or miso.
So fermentation isn't just for preservation.
Not at all. It fundamentally transforms the food. It breaks down anti-nutrients, often reduces the carbohydrate load, increases the bioavailability of minerals, creates new beneficial compounds like B vitamins, populates the food with probiotics, and enhances flavor complexity. For most of history, things like bread weren't made with rapidly processed flour. They involved soaking, sprouting, or long fermentation of the grains first, predigestion, essentially.
Which brings us neatly into Section 3. We've gone from the foundational grain logistics of ancient states to the often problematic derivatives in modern food. Now we hit the core biological failure point, insulin resistance, or IR.
Yeah, IR is arguably the central metabolic derangement underlying most of the chronic, non-communicable diseases plaguing us today. And fundamentally, IR is a state of hyperinsulinemia.
Meaning too much insulin.
Way too much insulin circulating in the blood, chronically. We usually think of insulin just for blood sugar control, right? After a meal, it tells cells to take up glucose, but that's only one of its many jobs. Insulin is a master hormone. It affects practically every single cell in the body.
So it's not just about sugar.
Not by a long shot. It's a major growth signal. It affects fat storage, protein synthesis, mineral balance, blood vessel function. You name it. When your cells, especially muscle, liver, fat cells, start becoming resistant or deaf to the insulin signal, the pancreas tries to compensate. It screams louder by pumping out more insulin.
And it's that high level of insulin itself, the hyperinsulinemia, that becomes the problem.
That's the core issue driving the damage. This state is linked to, 5 of the top 7 leading causes of death in the U.S.? Heart disease, cancer, stroke, Alzheimer's, diabetes, all strongly associated with underlying insulin resistance.
Okay, let's break down how this high insulin causes damage, starting with the heart and blood vessels.
Right. High insulin does a couple of nasty things here. First, it signals the kidneys to retain sodium, to hold on to salt.
Even if you're not eating a lot of salt.
Independent of dietary salt intake, yeah. Retaining salt means retaining water, which increases blood volume, which directly increases blood pressure. Hypertension.
Okay, what else?
Second, remember, insulin is an anabolic hormone. It tells things to grow. Chronically high insulin tells the smooth muscle cells in your blood vessel walls, especially the endothelium, that critical inner lining, to grow, to thicken.
So your blood vessels literally get thicker and narrower?
Exactly. This thickening, this loss of flexibility, is a foundational step in atherosclerosis, the hardening of the arteries. It often happens before cholesterol starts building up in plaques. The high insulin is remodeling the vessels in a harmful way.
Wow. Okay, what about cancer? How does insulin resistance play into that?
It's a huge factor, increasingly recognized. IR is consistently linked to both increased cancer risk and worse outcomes, higher lethality. For instance, having IR can triple the risk of death if you have colorectal cancer.
Why? Is it fueling the cancer?
In many ways, yes. Elevated insulin acts like pouring gasoline on a fire for many cancers. It's a potent growth signal, especially for tissues that are sensitive to hormonal signals, like breast and prostate tissue.
And do cancer cells respond differently?
Often, yes. Studies show that many tumor cells actually develop an increased number of insulin receptors on their surface. They become hyper-responsive, soaking up that growth signal from the high insulin environment. So, controlling insulin can be seen as cutting off a key fuel supply and growth promoter for the cancer.
Okay, cardiovascular cancer. What about reproduction?
Big implications there, too. Insulin resistance is now understood to be the fundamental metabolic problem underlying polycystic ovary syndrome, or PCOS, a major cause of infertility.
And during pregnancy?
It significantly bumps up the risk for gestational diabetes.
Yeah.
And the effects on the baby are complex. It's kind of a paradox, actually.
How so?
Well, babies born at either extreme, very high birth weight or very low birth weight both seem to have a higher risk of developing obesity and insulin resistance themselves later in life.
That seems counterintuitive. Low birth weight, too.
Yeah. Low birth weight infants often experience rapid catch-up growth after birth, primarily accumulating body fat. This seems to program their metabolism towards higher insulin levels and increases their risk for earlier puberty and metabolic problems down the road. It's like the body perceived scarcity in the womb and overcompensated once resources were available.
Always adapting, but sometimes adapting in ways that don't serve us well in the modern environment.
Exactly. And then there's the brain, arguably the most critical organ affected.
The brain becomes insulin resistant too.
Yes. The brain is a glucose hog, incredibly metabolically active. When brain cells become insulin resistant, their ability to take up and use glucose efficiently is impaired. It's like an energy crisis in the brain.
And this connects to cognitive decline, Alzheimer's.
Strongly. Some researchers are now calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. The evidence is mounting that brain insulin resistance is a key mechanism, maybe even initiating the formation of those damaging beta amyloid plaques associated with the disease.
So having type 2 diabetes dramatically increases your Alzheimer's risk.
By up to 4 times, according to some studies. But even before full-blown diabetes, Conditions like prediabetes or even just mild cognitive impairment are very frequently linked with underlying IR and metabolic syndrome. The brain is highly vulnerable to this.
Okay, so IR is driven by diet, primarily sugar and refined carbs. But you mentioned there are non-dietary factors too, lifestyle toxins.
Absolutely, can't ignore these. First, inhaled toxins, think cigarette smoke, even secondhand, and general air pollution.
How do they cause insulin resistance?
They often contain inflammatory molecules, like something called LPS, lipopolysaccharide. It's basically fragments of bacterial cell walls, common in polluted air and smoke. When you inhale this stuff, it gets into your bloodstream and triggers a massive inflammatory response system-wide.
Like a false alarm for infection?
Kind of. It activates inflammatory messengers called cytokines. These circulating cytokines then travel to distant tissues, like your liver and muscles, and essentially tell them to become insulin resistant right now. It's an emergency signal that messes up normal metabolic processing, completely independent of what you just ate.
Wow, okay, what else besides inhaled toxins?
Stored toxins. These are often foreign, fat-soluble chemicals that our bodies don't easily eliminate. Things like BPA from plastics or older pesticides like organochlorines, OCs. Where do they go? They get stored in our fat tissue.
And is all fat storage equal?
No. Alarmingly, these toxins tend to concentrate much more heavily, maybe up to 10 times more, in visceral fat compared to the subcutaneous fat just under your skin.
And remind us why visceral fat, the belly fat around the organs, is so dangerous.
Because it's not just passive storage. Visceral fat is highly metabolically active. It's constantly churning out its own inflammatory signals and leaking fatty acids and those stored toxins directly into the portal lane, which goes straight to the liver. It's like having a toxic waste dump right next to your metabolic control center, constantly poisoning the system and driving liver insulin resistance.
Nasty stuff. Okay, inhaled, stored. What's the last one?
The last one is really surprising. The salt paradox. For decades, we've been told to slash salt intake to control blood pressure. But some research suggests that eating too little salt might actually worsen insulin resistance.
Wait, too little salt makes IR worse. How?
It seems counterintuitive, I know. And it appears to be independent of blood pressure changes. The thinking relates to basic cell function, specifically the sodium-potassium pumps in our cell membranes. These pumps are crucial for maintaining the electrical gradients needed for nerve function, muscle contraction, and importantly, for insulin signaling and glucose transport into cells.
Okay.
When dietary sodium intake gets too low, the efficiency of these pumps can decrease. And studies have shown that in these low-salt conditions, subjects can become measurably more insulin resistant. It suggests there's a sweet spot for salt intake, and the blanket less is always better message might be metabolically problematic for some people. It's complex.
All right, if insulin resistance is the central problem, the downstream effect, what's the upstream trigger? You pointed to uric acid, UA, as a major culprit.
Yes, uric acid is shifting from being seen as just the cause of gout to being recognized as a really potent physiologic alarm signal. It's now considered a key early marker for metabolic syndrome. High UA doesn't just show up after the damage is done. It actively precedes and helps predict the development of heart disease, kidney disease, and metabolic dysfunction.
And it affects the brain, too, even without gout.
Definitely. Studies are linking elevated UA levels directly to things like brain shrinkage and cognitive decline, even in people who never experience a gout attack. It seems to be exerting a silent negative effect on brain health.
And the danger levels might be lower than we think. You mentioned some specific numbers.
Yeah, the data emerging is a bit concerning when compared to standard lab ranges. Some research suggests brain degeneration starts to become measurable when hemoglobin A1C hits 5.5%, which is often still considered non-diabetic, and when fasting blood glucose creeps up to around 105 milli-GDL, values many doctors might dismiss as normal, or just borderline, could already be in a metabolically risky zone, often correlated with rising uric acid.
So where does all this excess uric acid come from? You linked it tightly with fructose.
That's the main driver in the modern diet. Fructose, which is half of table sugar, sucrose, and the main component of high fructose corn syrup, has a unique and particularly damaging metabolic pathway compared to glucose.
How's it different?
Unlike glucose, which pretty much any cell can use for energy, fructose is handled almost exclusively by the liver. And when it hits the liver, especially in liquid form like in sodas or juices, it gets absorbed super fast and triggers some dramatic effects.
What's the mechanism?
It causes a rapid depletion of the cell's main energy molecule, ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Fructose metabolism essentially burns through ATP, converting it to AMP, adenosine monophosphate. This process, the breakdown of AMP, ultimately generates uric acid as a byproduct.
So processing fructose creates uric acid and drains cellular energy.
Exactly, and this kicks off a nasty, vicious feedback loop. High uric acid levels then act almost like a drug pusher inside the cell. UA actually stimulates the key enzyme that metabolizes fructose, called fructokinase.
So high uric acid tells the cell to process more fructose.
Yes, which then generates more uric acid, further depletes energy, ramps up inflammation, oxidative stress, fat production, de novo lipogenesis, in the liver, and drives insulin resistance even harder.
It sounds like a runaway train.
It's essentially hijacking an ancient survival pathway. Our sources suggest this whole cascade fructose-generating UA-promoting fat storage was originally a brilliant adaptation. Think about animals preparing for winter. Eating a lot of fruit in late summer would raise UA, signaling the body to convert that fructose aggressively into fat to survive the coming scarcity.
But we're triggering that store fat for winter signal all year round now.
Pretty much, yeah. With constant access to high fructose foods and drinks, we get that survival alarm blaring 24/7, inappropriately activated in a time of constant abundance, leading directly to metabolic disease.
Okay, so fructose is the primary sugar toxin driving this UAIR loop. You also mentioned a primary fat toxin, vegetable oils.
Yes, the common, cheap industrial seed oils. Canola, rapeseed, corn, soy, sunflower, safflower, cottonseed. Our sources describe these as essentially molecular static or even chemical firebombs in our biology.
Why are they considered toxic? Isn't fat necessary?
It's not the fat itself, but the type of fat and how it's processed. These oils are extremely high in delicate polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUFAs, primarily omega-6s. These PUFAs are inherently unstable and very prone to damage from heat, light, and oxygen.
And the industrial processing makes it worse.
Massively worse.
Yep.
The typical process involves high heat, chemical solvents like hexane to extract the oil, then refining, bleaching, and deodorizing, RBD. This harsh treatment structurally damages those fragile PUFAs, oxidizing them and creating harmful byproducts even before they hit the bottle.
And what happens when we consume these damaged fats? You mentioned a zombie effect.
Right. When these damaged oxidized PUFAs, including toxic derivatives sometimes called megatrans fats, like a specific aldehyde called 4-HNE, get into our cells and cell membranes, they can trigger a runaway chain reaction.
How does that work?
It's a free radical cascade. One damaged fatty acid molecule can bump into a healthy one and damage it, turning it into another zombie. This can propagate incredibly fast, potentially damaging billions of healthy fatty acid molecules per second. It creates widespread oxidative stress and membrane damage.
Spreading the damage systemically. What are the consequences?
They're far-reaching. Our sources link this oxidative damage from vegetable oils to arterial damage, described graphically as a French fried heart, meaning fragile, easily damaged blood vessel tissue. It makes the brain more susceptible to injury. It can contribute to erectile dysfunction by damaging the endothelial cells needed for nitric oxide production, kind of an anti-Viagra effect.
And potentially even birth defects.
Yes, the oxidative stress generated by these damaged fats, particularly during fetal development, has been linked to increased risk of developmental issues like spinal and heart defects. The building materials are compromised.
You also mentioned a direct link to gestate damage, 4-HNE.
Yes, that specific toxic byproduct, 4-HNE, 4-hydroxynonenal, is particularly nasty. It's known to be a potent genotoxin and carcinogen. It can directly bind to DNA.
What does that do?
It physically gets in the way when DNA tries to replicate or repair itself. It massively increases the error rate. Our sources state it can increase the chance of a DNA mutation by potentially up to 1 million times.
1 million times? That's staggering.
It is. This kind of accumulated damage, these epigenetic and potentially genetic errors passed down, is implicated in the rising rates of conditions possibly linked to de novo new mutations, sometimes grouped under terms like DINGs, disorders involving neurogenesis and synaptogenesis, which may include conditions like autism. It's a potential mechanism for generational harm.
And this whole crisis of the dominance of these oils was kind of paved by historical misdirection. You mentioned Ansel Keys again.
Yes, it's crucial to understand this context. Ansel Keys' highly influential 6-country study famously pointed the finger at saturated animal fat as the cause of heart disease. This changed dietary guidelines worldwide, pushing people away from butter, lard, tallow, and towards vegetable oils and margarine.
But there is a problem with his own experiments.
A massive, arguably deceptive problem. When Keys conducted human trials supposedly testing the effects of different fats, the high saturated fat diet he used to induce negative effects wasn't just pure animal fat. He used diets incorporating margarine.
And margarine back then.
Margarine at that time was heavily made from partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, meaning it was loaded with artificial trans fats. One analysis suggests that the margarine used was up to 48% trans fat.
So he was condemning saturated fat based on results likely caused by the industrial trans fats in margarine.
That's what the evidence strongly suggests. He was essentially feeding people the very processed, inflammatory vegetable oil-based fats we now know are incredibly harmful, blaming the resulting damage on traditional animal fats. And this fundamental flaw was never really made clear to the public or corrected in policy.
Allowing vegetable oils to seem like the healthy alternative, while they were potentially fueling the very problems Keyes claimed to be fighting.
Exactly. A tragic confluence of flawed science, potentially confirmation bias, and industrial food interests that has had devastating consequences for public health.
Okay, after laying out the historical forces and the molecular mayhem, we need the what now, the actionable plan. How do we reclaim our health from this metabolic mess? You mentioned the LUV plan.
Yes, LUV stands for lowering insulin and uric acid values. It's about targeting those two key upstream drivers we've been discussing. And the absolute foundational step is addressing carbohydrates.
Specifically restricting them.
Primarily restricting the refined ones, yes. Because here's the key insight. Dietary fat, including saturated fat, has virtually zero direct impact on insulin secretion. Carbohydrates, especially sugars and starches, are what drive blood glucose up, which then drives insulin up.
So eating fewer carbs means lower glucose, which means lower insulin needs.
Exactly. And lower insulin allows your cells to regain sensitivity over time. It breaks that cycle of resistance.
For many people, this points towards lower carb or even ketogenic approaches.
It often does, yeah. Focusing on getting calories from healthful fats, aiming for maybe 60–80% along with adequate protein, usually low purine sources if uric acid is a concern, and drastically reducing sugars and refined starches.
And top of the do not eat list, the KAPU list as you called it.
Absolutely number 1 and 2, industrially produced vegetable seed oils and added sugars, especially anything containing fructose like table sugar or HFCS. Those are the primary metabolic disruptors to eliminate.
Can we bring back those 4 pillars here? Fermentation.
Definitely. Fermentation is like a biological cheat code. It pre-digests carbs, reducing the starch load, and adds probiotics. Using things like raw apple cider vinegar with a meal, or choosing properly fermented sourdough over standard bread can significantly blunt the glucose and insulin spike from the carbs you do eat.
Are there any modern tools or sweeteners that fit this model? You mentioned allulose.
Yeah, allulose is interesting. It's technically a sugar, chemically similar to fructose, but our bodies don't metabolize it the same way. It provides sweetness, but doesn't raise blood glucose or insulin.
So it doesn't trigger that harmful fructose UA pathway?
Correct. It seems to bypass it, and some early research even suggests it might improve insulin sensitivity. So it could be a safer way to get some sweetness without the metabolic downsides. Natural sweeteners like pure stevia or monk fruit also fit, and even small amounts of honey or very dark chocolate can be okay for some, in moderation, watching the fructose load.
Okay, diet is foundational. What about lifestyle factors?
Movement. Movement is critical. But it's not just about needing. The intensity seems particularly important for insulin sensitivity.
Intensity over duration.
Intensity seems to be the second most important variable, right after just being consistent, doing it regularly. We're talking about high-intensity interval training, HIIT.
Why is HIIT so effective metabolically?
Because short bursts of really intense effort rapidly deplete the glycogen, the stored sugar, in your muscles. When muscle glycogen is low, your muscles become incredibly hungry for glucose and super sensitive to insulin signal to take it up. It flips a metabolic switch very effectively.
So you don't need hours in the gym?
Not necessarily for this benefit. There was one striking study where participants did just 15 minutes total of HI, like a few short sprints spread out over a 2-week period, and that tiny amount of intense work was enough to double their muscle power and significantly improve insulin sensitivity markers. Maximum signal, minimum time.
Powerful stuff. What about the timing of when we eat? Time-restricted eating, TRE.
Also a very powerful tool. The basic idea is simple. Consolidate all your daily calories into a shorter window, say starting with a 12-hour eating window, and maybe aiming to shrink it down to 8 or 10 hours eventually.
Giving your body a longer fasting period each day, why is that beneficial?
Because it takes about 12 hours after your last bite of food for your body to fully shift out of the fed state and enter the truly fasted state. This is when insulin levels drop low enough to allow fat burning to really ramp up, and cellular cleanup processes like autophagy can occur. It gives your system a much-needed break from constant digestion and insulin signaling, allowing tissues to reset and resensitize.
So a 12-hour overnight fast is kind of the minimum threshold for those benefits.
That seems to be the biological requirement to really flip into that beneficial fasted metabolism each day.
Okay, diet, intensity, timing. What about sleep?
Hugely important and often overlooked. Poor sleep quality is a massive metabolic saboteur. It's scientifically shown that even one night of bad sleep can significantly elevate uric acid levels the next day.
Wow, as much as drinking a sugary drink.
Potentially in that ballpark, yeah. Sleep disruption directly messes with hormonal balance, including insulin and cortisol, pushing you towards resistance.
So prioritizing sleep hygiene is key. Any specific tips?
Consistency is paramount. While focusing on bedtime is good, the most powerful anchor for your circadian rhythm is actually maintaining a consistent, strict wake time, even on weekends. This helps lock in your body's internal clock, making it easier to fall asleep and get the recommended 7 to 9 hours of quality restorative rest.
Makes sense. Fix the wake-up call, and bedtime often follows. Finally, you encourage people to become their own health detective. Take the acid test.
Absolutely. Don't just rely on how you feel or on standard, often outdated guidelines. Measure things. Be data-driven about your own biology.
What should people measure?
If you can, get your fasting insulin tested. Ideally, you want it low, below 6 nml, which is about 41 pml. If it's moderately elevated, say 7 to 17, you definitely need to make changes. If it's high, over 18, intervention is urgent.
But maybe the most accessible and powerful tools.
Routinely testing your uric acid and your blood glucose. Ideally, using a continuous glucose monitor, CGM, can be incredibly insightful. It allows you to see, in real time, exactly how your body responds to specific foods, exercise, stress, sleep. It gives you personalized data to fine-tune your approach. That knowledge is power.
So this deep dive has really taken us on quite a journey. Thousands of years, from Mesopotamian logistics to our own cellular mechanics. But that core principle seems remarkably consistent, doesn't it?
It really does. Success, whether for an ancient civilization or for an individual human body, seems to boil down to managing resources and inputs effectively. The logistics of life, really.
The early states, they thrived when they could concentrate and control those narrow, legible resources like grain, but they were always constrained by the physics of transport, that 48-kilometer radius for overland stuff. Push beyond that or let the resource base degrade and fragility set in. Collapse.
And today, the same principle plays out internally. Our molecular logistics are overwhelmed by the sheer volume and toxicity of inputs we were never evolved to handle at this scale. Primarily that refined fructose and those unstable industrial seed oils. They sabotage our cellular machinery, our epigenetic software.
Driving us into that state of metabolic chaos, insulin resistance, high uric acid.
Exactly. And it leads to a final, perhaps provocative thought. This epigenetic integrity, this blueprint for health that we inherit, it's not just ours.
What do you mean?
We receive it from previous generations. We benefit from it or suffer from its degradation during our lifetime. But we are also the stewards who must protect it before passing it on. It's a sacred vessel in a way.
So, if our modern diet is constantly bombarding our cells with the wrong chemical signals, like signals of scarcity, danger, inflammation, oxidation, what kind of message are we encoding?
What is the genetic and epigenetic legacy we are programming right now for the children, the grandchildren, the future generations who might live hundreds of years from now? That ultimately might be the most profound connection between the food on our plate today and the long-term generational wealth of human health and potential.